Membership. Looking around the room, almost all of you are members. However, if you're not, please consider taking one out. Or maybe you'd like to gift a friend a membership that they could help. We have a goal this year of bringing in 60 new members. So if you could help us reach that, that would be wonderful. Our next Lunch and Learn is next week, and it's David Wade Morton speaking on colonial women. So kind of get into the whole 100th anniversary of suffrage in New York thing. So today's speaker, I've actually known Diane the entire time I've been here. I was looking at my thank you that I put in the newsletter when Diane stepped down as board president in 2012. She was my second contact here, but she was very excited and encouraged me to come here. So she grew up in Maine, New York, and attended the Eastman School of Music, which if you've ever heard her play the piano, it's beautiful. She was our board president from 2008 until 2012, and she still continues here as a trustee. She's the director of the Whitechapel Ringers at the Presbyterian Church here in Cortland. But from what I've known of her recently, especially, I think her favorite title is grandmother. She loves the grandchildren. And I think that's common. I know my grandmother says the same thing.
Thanks, Judy. And I've also been the wife of the Clockwinder for 41 years, 7 months, and it's all been tickingly wonderful. I wrote this paper back in 2015 to fulfill the study that we were doing at the Ladies Literary Club about Cortland. And I said, what am I going to write about? And Bud said, well, write about the clock. So I expanded it a little and wrote about, I've lived with the Clockwinder for 40 years. Okay, step back in time with me to November 29th, 1883, and hear the words written in the Cortland Standard. The old town clock is silent. Its sonorous tones as it strikes out the hour are heard no more. The eyes of the passerby that are turned mechanically upward toward it find the hands pointing in any direction but the right. The venerable timepiece evidently does not intend, at its age, to follow the new standard time. And after many years of toil, it will give way to the new clock, which will soon be placed in the tower of the Squires Building. So we're back 1883. The new clock was installed on December 14th, 1883, by a Mr. W.H. Prescott, an associate of the Howard Watch and Clock Company located in Boston, Massachusetts. Between $200 and $300 had been subscribed for the new clock, which would grace the tower of the new Squires Building. Businessman James Squires completed the clock tower building, known as the Squires Building, that same year, 1883. So who was James Squires? Mr. Squires appears to have been an outstanding citizen. He was born in Virgil, New York. His neighbors described him as a merchant at birth. At the age of 10, Squires was already engaged in profit-making ventures. He purchased a quantity of top onion seed of his brother at 6 cents a quart, which he sold among his neighbors during the evenings at 10 cents. In this way, he made 50 cents, which he invested in a lamb, which he left for a term of years to double, and from the increase of his investment, he found himself the possessor, at the time of his first marriage, when he was 24 years old, of 32 sheep. Growing up, his family life centered about work on the farm, so his schooling was intermittent and often self-guided. It is said that he would read voraciously in front of the fireplace during the evening. At the age of 18, Squires studied one full term under Nathan Boughton. And I learned about Nathan Boughton when I was doing my research about the Underground Railroad. Squires, whose success in the school was prominent, prompted Mr. Boughton to give him a certificate to teach. Squires went on to become the Virgil postmaster and the superintendent of the Virgil School. In 1853, James Squires moved to Cortland Village, where he ran a successful mercantile business with a yearly trade of $100,000. That amazed me. Mr. Squires worked to help establish the Cortland Normal School. He served on the boards of several local railroad companies, and he supported the building of the Baptist Church in Cortland. 30 years after his arrival in Cortland, Squires built the Clock Tower building. It was said to have cost $40,000 and housed 7 stores, 8 offices, and 10 rental flats. It stood on a portion of land which had housed the Eagle store, built by General Roswell Randall in 1815. There seems to be no information as to what happened to the old clock, which preceded the new clock in the Squires Building. However, an article in the Cortland Standard on January 11, 1971, tells the story of the new 1883 timepiece. The new clock for the Squires Building arrived in Cortland on Monday morning last, 6 days in transit. Mr. Prescott from the Howard Company in Boston came on Tuesday morning and at once commenced unpacking and placing the clock in position. He hoped to have the work completed today. 14 days later, the clock was up and running. So what's new, right? The clock is one of the E. Howard Watch and Clock Company's #1 movements and is guaranteed to run within 30 seconds a month of exact time. To ease replacement in case of breakage, ground plate glass sections, as opposed to solid plate, were fitted into the iron frame. The Cortland Standard article went on to say, there is also connected with the clock an automatic attachment for turning on the gas for illumination and turning it down so that the smallest possible jet is left burning. Amazingly, it could also be set to turn the gas up or down at specified times. So, who wound the clock? There seem to be no records as to who wound the city's clock until 1936, when Mr. Charles A. Kellogg accepted the responsibility. Kellogg was an alderman. At a meeting of the Common Council, the city offered to pay $25 a year to anyone who would wind the clock. Kellogg noted that no one jumped at the chance. In fact, and I quote, no one even looked up. So Mr. Kellogg told the mayor he would do it if no one else volunteered. For 34 years, Mr. Charles A. Kellogg wound the city clock. He retired in 1970 at the age of 83. On January 5th, 1971, the Honorable Mayor Morris Noss and the Cortland City Council appointed Donald S. Bud Ames as the new official clockwinder. Bud beat Mr. Kellogg's tenure by 1 year, serving in the position for 35 years. Sadly, the Parker Building, formerly the Squires Building, burned in 2006 and cut his record short. So, what did it take to wind the city's clock? Getting to the clock involved walking up 3 flights of stairs and through the apartment complex to apartment 14. Once access was gained into the apartment, there was yet another flight of stairs to reach the clock tower. 78 steps in all. Starting in 1971, Bud faithfully wound the clock every Wednesday between 5 and 5:15. 2 older ladies lived in the apartment, and if he was late, they would not let him in. Now, we were married in 1975, and I recall that sometimes in those early years, business would delay Bud's arrival to wind the clock, and thus his entry into apartment 14. In order to keep Cortland on time, he would go to the basement of the building and retrieve a ladder. He would then carry the ladder up to the 2nd floor, above the pet store. Who remembers the pet store? Anybody remember the pet
I
store?
think on the Main Street side, yes?
Yes, and
On the Main Street.
Main Street side.
Next to the Jiffy Wash.
If you say so. Yeah,
Agnes Dexter's Jiffy Wash.
okay. In the hallway, he could access a trap door and climb the ladder, emerging on the 3rd floor ceiling. Carefully crossing the ceiling joists, he eventually could access a trap door to the clock tower. Once in the tower, he would wind the crank 26 times, and if necessary, oil the mechanism. The clock was powered by a weight connected to a system of pulleys which turned a series of gears. Winding the clock often meant encounters with pigeons and their leftovers. When the ladies moved on and college students began to occupy the keeper of the clock apartment, Bud's routine changed to Monday nights before the Wise Men's Service Club meeting. Mr. Kellogg and Bud took care of all maintenance. When Mr. Kellogg assumed the task, he described the clock as a mess. It looked as though it hadn't been oiled in 4 years. There was a 7.5-minute slop in the minute hand, which he was able to correct to 1.5 minutes. The funny thing about this is that after Mr. Kellogg's work, the slop was still there. But sometimes it would slop ahead, and sometimes it would slop backwards, thus usually maintaining the correct time. And slop is an Old English term which literally means something slipped over. In 1981, Bud told the Cortland Standard that the only repair to the clock had been the replacement of a gas light used to illuminate the face with an electric light. And here's an article that we can pass around with a picture. You'll see that Bud has changed just a little, not much. In May of 1989, when the clock was 106 years old, the pendulum hanger broke, putting the clock out of service for nearly 2 months. The hands were stuck at 6:55. Bud launched a nationwide search for the replacement parts with no success. Bob Cargan of 9 Lansing Avenue. Anybody know? Okay. He was a tool and die and pattern maker, and he came to the rescue. He fabricated a new part out of 2 small strips of spring steel, and the clock worked perfectly from then on. And here's another article. I'll send this one around this way. Some pictures. One of the most exciting times for the clock tower occurred at midnight on December 31st, 1999, when the tower was the site for the New Year's Eve party to welcome the year 2000. For years ahead, the clock face was adorned with a huge wreath, which Bud had procured. John Scanlon, then owner of the building, had attached huge numbers. 2000. A large lighted ball, mimicking the ball in Times Square, was in place, ready to fall at the stroke of midnight. Behind the scenes, logistics were worked out as Bud and others manned the ropes to drop the ball at precisely midnight, when the numbers of the new century would illuminate. And they did. A crowd of several thousand cheered the new year in, and one lady was heard to say, "It's 2000, and the electricity is still on." Do you remember why? Because there was a huge scare that there would be a computer glitch as we turned this, and the world would come to a stop. Well, Cortland City Clockwinders did not get rich from their annual pay. As was mentioned, Mr. Kellogg wound the clock for a princely sum of $25 a year. In 1971, Bud was paid $100 a year. In 1982, the city budget passed with a line item of $170. However, that covered the electricity used to light the dial and Bud's salary, still $100. Bud recalls that Mayor Binky Walsh gave him a raise, which brought the annual rate to $109 a year. Bud did worry sometimes about what would happen to the clock should there be a fire. He said that he and Mayor Francis Bud Quinlan, the former fire chief, had a plan to save the clock in case a fire ever hit the building. This is a quote. "I would run up and grab the clock and then run down the ladder of the fire truck." There had been one fire in the mid-1970s, but the tower and the clock were spared. Not so on April 11th, 2006. A fire destroyed the Squires Building. Firefighters collected the pieces of the clock, and it was stored at the Cortland Armory for several years. Fortunately, all the major parts of the clock were intact. Under the leadership of Russ Oshel, a Homer clock expert, The 1883 clock has been restored. Michael Brown of Brown's Body Shop used a baking soda air blasting system to clean the face and mechanical portions. Russ and Bud did some of the repainting in our garage. A corps of volunteers raised the funds and built a lovely new facade to house the clock at the Brockway Museum in the Center for Living History on Route 11 in Homer. So, here are a couple more pictures of setting the clock in place after the fire. And then I'll pass these around. These are of the replacement up at the Center for Living History. A couple more pictures there. So, drive by the Brockway Museum and smile as you see the correct time of day in the beautifully illuminated Cortland City clock. But I do wonder how much slop there is in the movement now. Now, there's one more piece. I'd like to ask the Clockwinder to share at least portions of the speech he gave upon the dedication of the clock up at the Center for Living History.
Well, I wouldn't call it a speech, but I call it some comments. Most of them are familiar to Diane and agree with her comments today, but some of them are a little different. So we'll go with mine. Okay. So let me read some of this through and then we'll talk some more. I guess I was just an average American boy who was fascinated with clocks. I remember taking one clock apart and could never get it back together again, and I quit. So when sitting at the Rotary Club the other day with Maury Noss and George Yeager, when the clock was stopped, that's how this whole thing started, as Diane said. He said, "Mary, you got to get somebody to wind that clock." And he said, "What? We recognize that." And I said, "Well, if you can't find somebody, I'll do it. But I need a raise." And I told him that right from day one. And so the next, well, I'll get into this later. So my comments here is how I helped everyone get to work on time. Okay, and remembering on Friday, December 14th, 1883, Cortland's new tower clock was running, which complemented the many factory whistles, assuring that everyone would get to work on time. You heard that Charles Kellogg, at this time he was winding the clock, at the time he had to retire, was living in Homer. And actually one of his boys came down to wind the clock because neither one of them could get along with the women. So that's what finally precipitated the ending of Charles' career was those two elderly spinsters up there that a little particular. Okay. I was always, when Diane said I was walking across rafters, I was walking like this across rafters, scared to death that my foot would go down through. So, but that's the way we had to do it. So back to Maury Noss. Maury, his comments were after they appointed me, the Common Council meeting. He said they had a lot of applicants and it was a close call for them as to whether I was going to be the Clockwinder. But he did. He came back a year later and he gave me a nice badge. And I don't know whether, did you ever get a meter reader's badge? About the same time we did? We all got one? I know Chief over here, he got his.
I had Paul's.
You got Paul McLaughlin's? Okay, well mine is over there in the one of the picture frames over there. You can see the size of it. I'm assuming yours was probably much bigger than mine. And I know what Chief's was.
Bud's is about the size of a nickel.
Maury Noss, those of us who knew him, he was just an aggressive sort of a guy and a nice guy to know. But he gave a badge at that same year to Delbert Smith, who was the dog catcher. You'd see Delbert riding around town, this great big Dodge pickup truck with a dog sitting in his front seat going home with him. So we all got Chief's badges. Peter Bennett was a Rotarian at the time. He was a city clerk, and he, along with Warren Eddy, the Cortland librarian, researched the early Common Council records and provided a lot of information to Dan Fagan, who was a cub reporter for the Cortland Standard at the time. Dan Fagan, and he wrote many of these articles that you'll see on the background here. We talked about the clock with the gas light. The time we got there, the electrical conversion had been made, but the gas pipe was still sitting there, capped off. So I was always scared to death about the natural gas catching fire there. The clock did stop occasionally, but usually it wasn't due to the clock's problem, it was due to the pigeons getting in the gears. And then later on, when the college kids lived in the apartments, they would go up and would be monkeying around with the clock a lot.
They did?
Oh, yeah. And I tried to keep a lock on it, but they bust the locks off, but it was more, it got to be more and more of a challenge. So we talked about for a long time about making it automatic. But a lot of people got involved with me, but we never figured out how to quite get it done. So, okay, what happened when the clock did stop? I used to say the whole city came to a stop, but that was being generous, I guess. But the most frequent callers were Dave Albert at the First National Bank and Kevin Howe and Skip Chapman at the Cortland Standard, whose offices directly faced the clock. Once I was blamed for a late newspaper run. But somehow the bank always opened on time. Even though their electrical clock and the Cortland Savings Bank clock, they were never in sync. It was my time that kept the city officially on time. Diane talked about a pay raise. Mayor Noss did give me a 5% raise once when the union got after him. So I got a raise to $2.03 a week. And then Binky Walsh gave me another little raise, as Diane said. Quinn and I, we had a serious plan to make that work, but he obviously didn't give it to the new chief. And when I got there ready to run up the ladder, he wouldn't let me. But the real hero in this is Russ Oshel. Russ was the guy that put that clock back together again. And those of you who have seen the clock, you will recognize the work he did. He's the only guy that I know of that has a tower clock in his garage. Okay, so he knows all about tower clocks and writes articles on clocks and tower clocks. So when you see Russ, thank Russell. Yeah, I did a little bit, and Mike Brown over there, and on Route 90, and several other people did a lot of nice work on it, but it was Russ's leadership that got that done for us. So that's the story of my story of the clock after 35 years. Lots of stories. Oh, the pet shop, you mentioned the pet shop. Walking up through the odors from the pet shop and the pizza shop, and then the shoe store, Rocky shoe store, those odors all just came right through that clock tower like a chimney. And that was a little ripe, which probably attracted the pigeons.
Was it enclosed? I don't remember.
Well, the clock was
How did pigeons get in, I guess?
well, the building was falling down.
Oh, okay.
They're kind of like bats.
Were there bats up there?
They used to have a bat or two that would show up, yeah.
Yeah.
The clock was designed for 4 faces, but apparently they only had enough money, they raised enough money just for the single face. So if you remember the clock, they had four sides, and the clock was designed for 4. It did not have the bells or any of the chimes that go with it, but it was just a plain 4-face clock.
The company is not in business anymore?
Actually, they are.
They are? It's
Yeah.
not, you said it was Howard, not Howard Miller, right?
No, Howard.
Howard.
E. Howard clock. Okay. Now, don't ask me how large their production is. I think it's a guy working out of his house or something.
Okay.
And as far as Bob, what was Bob Cargan?
Yeah.
Bob Cargan, yeah. He came up one day riding his bicycle up Main Street and said, he knew me, and he said, "Bud, I can fix your clock for you." I said, "Where you been for 2 months?" He saved my clock, of course, with his effort. So,
How long before you broke the habit of going out of your house at 5 o'clock?
it was, actually, I was on my way home, so I like to go home.
It was 5 o'clock at night that you went up.
Yeah, 5 o'clock.
When you were up there alone by yourself, did you talk to the clock?
Once in a while, I had a few words for it. When I was digging out the pigeon remains in the gears. Yeah, it was,
But think what good shape you were in from going up and down
That's
those
true.
stairs.
Did you ever fall?
never fell through, no, fortunately.
Wow.
Did this limit going away more than Wednesday to Wednesday?
I had my assistant clockwinders.
Oh, you did?
I appointed a couple assistants, yeah. Never paid them, but. In fact, Richard Palmer, who will be here in 2 weeks, he was up in the clock with me a couple of times.
Oh dear.
Yes.
First, yeah. And before Diane, I used to have a few other friends up there.
Let me show you my clock.
My etchings did about the much.
I was wondering, how did you wind it, what did you do on the Wednesdays? You went there, I wasn't catching it all. 26.
Had to climb up 76 stairs to begin with from grade level, open a door, walk inside, and then turn a crank, which you can see the crank up at the historical, at the Living History Center. You can see the whole clock up there, and the crank is still there. I don't know how they found the crank, because basically that whole tower collapsed in on itself. And we
So
all
was the
remember-
crank affixed to the clock, or did the crank sit next to the clock?
No, the crank stayed right on the clock, right on the clock. You can see up there, it's just crank.
Now, did that have to wait?
That lifted the weight that went down 2 stories
Down
down,
2 stories.
down through the apartment.
Oh my God.
And it was just a bunch of field stones, just all
Uh-huh.
over the rocks in the box.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it wasn't, again, they were very sophisticated. This is 1880s.
Do you still have to wind it?
Yes.
Somebody's winding it up there. I don't know whether, Gene, who winds the clock up there now? Darlene?
Jim Madge is the primary.
Jim Nadges?
Yeah,
They do it daily because there's no hole in the floor.
right.
No, it-
It's a much shorter clock.
And then, of course,
Really?
Tom Kyle put that whole thing together up there. He's a fabulous volunteer also on the clock. So,
So on the 3rd floor, was it, and you were walking on the rafters and one foot in the other, so there was no.
there's no gangplank or anything else across there. I had to walk across like a tightrope.
Have many people that are sitting here been to Monticello, to Jefferson's house?
Yes.
With a clock that has that rope? And I think there's specifically cut hole in the floor because the house isn't high enough that they had to go all the way to the basement with these weights. So in the back of that house is the same kind of mechanism.
This was an 8-day clock, so, and again, it's determined by how far the drop is.
Right.
So, and today it's a 1-day clock.
Did the architect always design that apartment between the clockwinder and the clock?
You'll have to ask him, I don't know.
Well, I mean,
Was it permanent? Yes, the clock, my understanding was the clock tower was part of the original building.
but was the apartment that got in your way that you had to get through, was that something that was added later?
No, I think that was always an apartment. That whole second floor
Bad
was,
planning.
well, who would know? It worked that way for 100 years, it's just the
Yeah.
last 17 that.
Is there any information about the older clock, where it stood or what it looked like? There must be pictures.
Somebody here might be able to answer that. We couldn't find
No,
anything.
we tried and then couldn't find anything about the clock that preceded this one.
I don't think too many people until my daughter was doing her research paper on Main Street and things, and we went back to look at the William Randall and Roswell Randall and the general store that they owned, that we kind of mentally think, well, it was on Main Street, it was where Bernard's Clothing was, or it was over this way or that way. It was on Tompkins Street, about, if you think in terms of the Squires Building going up Tompkins Street, I can remember when Archie Ballone had a restaurant in the last space. When in fact, if you get the Sanborn book out, Randall's store was encompassed into the Squires Building. It was never torn down. The last space on the Squires Building is the exact dimensions of the William Randall General Store.
I've often wondered that because down
And
in
it
the
was
basement.
encompassed into the building when they built the
When
Squires
I
Building.
picked up the ladder down the basement, there was 2 distinct types of
Right.
construction
There
down
are 2 walls. It's gotta be,
there. Okay.
it's in the Sanborn book, and because the Sanborn book tells you businesses on Main Street, there's a code for brick, concrete, wood,
Stone.
and it's in these books. So you look at that Sanborn map and you can see that it was probably stone versus brick in 2 separate walls. So in fact, that really early building was taken down when they took the brick down for the Squires Building. It was encompassed right into it.
You mentioned that there was a fire in the 70s in the building.
It was on the other end, if I remember correctly.
There's a right out, St. Mary's Church had a major fire in the back of the church in the sacristy in 1958. And in the story, they said that there was a fire set in the Squires Building, which supposedly was to deter people getting to the church on time because somebody else had set a fire on the other end of
It was a
town.
diversion.
Yeah. And the fire at church obviously was much bigger than
And what year was this?
58.
58.
58.
It completely devastated the back of the sacristy, and it was $25,000 damage at the time. But they said in the story that there was also, and I never found another story saying that they tied him in. It was arson at St. Mary's Church. We know that somebody said it. But they also said that somebody set a fire at the other end of town to try to deter people from getting to the church on time to put that fire out. It was 6 o'clock on a Friday night.
Night.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
Thank you.